In the words of Giuseppe Verdi, here's the draft of Macbeth. This tragedy is one of the greatest creations of man. If we can't do something great with it, let us at least try to do something out of the ordinary.
Verdi's Macbeth premiered on March 14, 1847 at the Teatro della Pergola in Florence, Italy. The music was composed by Verdi and the libretto was written by Francesco Maria Piave. Verdi's Macbeth was the first faithful adaptation of Shakespearean theater to Italian opera. The music of Verdi's Macbeth initially puzzled its listeners, but eventually incited an obsession. With this work and this unhindered dedication, Verdi was able to introduce a truly special opera to the world. Without Verdi's touch, Macbeth could not have had the impact on opera it has had today.
Giuseppe Verdi began his musical journey at the age of 4, and by 9 years old, he was the organist at his local church. By 18, he was playing and composing music for a living and sought musical instruction in Milan. He procured private instruction from Vincenzo Lavigna, the Maestro Concertatore at La Scala. It is under his instruction that Verdi was introduced to the theater, starting his lifelong obsession with Shakespeare and opera. Verdi is quoted saying, "Shakespeare is a favorite poet of mine, whom I have had in my hands from earliest youth, and whom I read and reread constantly." By the premiere of Macbeth in 1847, Verdi was the up-and-coming star composer in the operatic world, just 8 years after the performance of his first opera, Oberto, in 1839.
Pairing his two obsessions, Verdi composed Macbeth. Until Macbeth, there had not been an Italian opera adapted to a Shakespearean play that had stayed faithful to Shakespeare. In fact, Verdi is considered to be the first to successfully transfer the psychological, political, and emotional themes of Shakespearean drama into an operatic setting. For example, Macbeth dealt with the complex themes of political corruption, tyrannical rule, longing for freedom, and plea for liberation, all of which connected to Verdi because of his great love for his country. Italy at the time was a fractured country, and those fractures parallel that of Macbeth. Therefore, Verdi chose a subject relating to his Italian audience while also allowing him to showcase music dealing with the supernatural with transalpine origins, suspense, tragedy, and horror. These themes are evident throughout the opera through the portrayal of the witches and the sinister effects they have on Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Also, Verdi's focus on creating a supernatural opera was a risk because there was no love story. The main characters, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, were bound by their ambition, not their love. Their inner conflicts about the murder of Duncan was the main conflict and driver of the plot. Furthermore, this opera was set apart because Verdi was faithful to Shakespeare's original story. Nevertheless, Verdi made a few key changes to make the production his own and to make it more musically compelling and dramatic. More on this later.
Verdi was a perfectionist at heart and would very often request changes to the libretto to reflect the colors and tones he wanted to portray in his music. This often meant rewriting some of the libretto line by line numerous times. Thus, Verdi was very difficult to work with, and more established librettists stayed away. The librettist of Macbeth and Verdi's favorite librettist in his early career was Francesco Maria Piave. Verdi admired Piave's willingness to collaborate, although both critics and Verdi himself often felt as if the poet's words fell flat. Despite his shortcomings, Piave worked well with Verdi to revise the majority of his sometimes harsh criticisms. Verdi's rough nature can be heard in this letter to Piave, where he states, "How wordy you always are." For example, the letter that Lady reads is just so many words cast in verse, little energy in the rest of the recitative. Too many words also in, "Who does feel himself strong for a conspiracy yet enters upon it, let him expect infamy and death." The same thing in a more elevated style can be said in half the words. Here, Verdi was very serious in his criticism of Piave. Moreover, this quote gives us an insight into the thinking of Verdi. It was Verdi's wish to make every word count, leaving no extra words. Overall, Verdi's work with Piave allowed for more freedom in its expression, creating an opera almost entirely that of the composer. It is this freedom and Verdi's strive for perfection which lead to the overall success of his Macbeth.
From his interactions with the librettist Piave, we have already seen examples of Verdi's borderline maniacal and dictatorial control over the writing of Macbeth, but to the determinant of the cast and crew, this behavior continued into the rehearsals. According to the memoirs of soprano Mariana Barberini, who played Lady Macbeth, Verdi never moved on from the scene until it was just right. He never gave encouragement or praise to the orchestra or singers. Moreover, in preparation for the opera, there was over 100 rehearsals for Macbeth. At these rehearsals, they would perform over and over again until the drama, text, motion, staging, and music all worked together. Sometimes, if you asked Verdi what he wanted to change, he wouldn't even tell you, only would tell you it needed to be rehearsed again. Mariana even said that on the day of the first performance, Verdi requested one more rehearsal of the duet with Verdi, to which they both objected, saying that they already have rehearsed it 150 times. To this, Verdi replied, "In half an hour it will be 151. Barberini said Verdi looked as if he was ready to murder Verdi. Nonetheless, Verdi managed to win over the performers and directors with his motivation, imagination, and passion.
Verdi's mental and physical health often waned, and for the 6 months before Verdi began work on Macbeth, he did almost nothing. During this time period, Verdi could not mentally or physically handle taking on any operas. Hence, when Verdi began work on Macbeth, it had his complete and direct attention. Using this time and his newfound health, Verdi wrote a draft of Macbeth himself before sending it to the Havre for revision and expansion. The passion and effort put in by Verdi therefore not only made the work special by making the opera more his own, but made the work special by gaining the admiration of his singers.
More praise of the dedication of Verdi and his singers is shown by Mariana Barberini. Mariana attributes the collective strong emotion and pride of her performers, musicians, and Verdi, tied to her famous sleepwalking scene, to the months of hard work and stress. The sheer time and dedication put into conforming this opera to Verdi's vision is a testament to the uniqueness of this opera. Macbeth is not only a work of art, but a work of blood, sweat, and tears. One of the most defining scenes of the opera is Lady Macbeth's final scene, her sleepwalking scene in Act 4. Verdi himself describes this as the high point of the opera and wanted to stay faithful to the original scene, so much so that he hired Andrea Maffei to take the place of Piaf to get the lines closer to that of the play. There are a few key differences of the opera and the play in the role of Lady Macbeth. In the opera, she's one of the most important characters. She's the driver for the action and evil. She convinces Macbeth to kill Banquo, instead of Macbeth deciding himself in Shakespeare's version. She dominates and controls everything in Verdi's adaptation, making her the villain of the story. She's on the side of the witches. The climax of the emotional torment is in the sleepwalking scene, with the English horn in the orchestra paralleling her inner cries. She's regretful and mournful of the events that have taken place. In Shakespeare's sleepwalking scene, Lady Macbeth is reacting to the events that have taken place, while in Verdi's sleepwalking scene, Lady Macbeth is repenting because she was the instigator for the murders. Here is a modern version of what that might have looked like.
In the image on the left, we see a representation of the scene that premiered in Florence, where Mariana Barberini performed the scene that took months of preparation. As we previously mentioned, Verdi was determined to perfect each scene. Verdi made sure that each aspect of Lady Macbeth's character was present in Barberinini's performance. from the hollowness and roughness of her voice to the way she acted as a sleepwalker. She spent months practicing her facial expressions, stance, singing, and movement in order to imitate a sleepwalker. Verdi's attention to detail in the scene shows his effort in making the scene not only believable, but also accurate to Shakespeare. The emotions tied to this scene of the play are enhanced in the opera, thus the music, gestures, and expressions of Barbieri further emphasize the psychological subject of Verdi's adaptation.
Along with Verdi, Ambramo Bossevi was disappointed in Piaf's work as a librettist. However, he says that the orchestra of the Pergola made up for this due to their ability to execute the music perfectly. Bossevi's opinion of the music ranged from critical to complimentary, but he praised the instrumental use in certain scenes. Luigi Casmortata and Enrico Montazio had similar reviews to the premieres of Verdi's Macbeth, emphasizing the differences in applause between the first and second performances. The second showing had substantially more applause when compared to the first, since the audience was allowed to process Verdi's genius and attention to detail. Casmortata and Montazio both talk about the crowd following Verdi when he was leaving the Teatro della Pergola, applauding him all the way to his place of residence.
Felice Baresi, who played Macbeth, said on the first night the opera had expectedly confused the audience. However, he goes on saying, "On the second night there was a wild, unheard-of enthusiasm. The maestro was called out innumerable times and was then accompanied home by a crowd of people who yelled like the damned." Baresi also says that he believes Verdi's new style is perfectly suited for the fantastical nature of Shakespeare's tragedy, and that this score of his is the most careful and the most artistically beautiful he has written. From the perspective of one of the lead roles, it is clear that this opera was a hit. Moreover, it is notable that this information is coming from someone who had endured the hundreds of rehearsals and constant gripes of Verdi. Thus, it is surprising that he of all people was deathly in love with his production.
In conclusion, it was clear from the premiere that Macbeth was going to be special due to Verdi's skill and attention to detail when transforming Shakespeare's Macbeth into an opera.
Verdi was just wading back into the operatic world with Macbeth, but his re-entrance was anything but a small splash.
Verdi took risk after risk when composing this opera. He had to create a whole new style of opera, a whole new style of composing. This opera lacked a traditional love story, and he did most of the adaptations on his own.
This opera was Verdi's riskiest opera to date, but it was his child. More influence from Verdi is seen within this opera than any of his others.
Therefore, it's unsurprising that with his unrelenting attention to detail,
his dictatorial control,
and his operatic genius,
Verdi managed to stay true to his words to Piaf and create not only a successful piece, but an extraordinary one. Thanks for watching.
Bye! No, we can't!